I'm Darlene Sandwell. I'm the chair of the neuroscience section within the Obesity Society. So this is basically a subsection of the Obesity Society targeted at membership engagement for people that are interested in neuroscience and how it relates to obesity. And so last year we put on a really fun event at the annual meeting, and we will do that again this year. Last year, Kevin spearheaded at least, I think, 2 or 3 webinars that went over really well. And so we're trying to repeat that success that he started for us this year. So this is our first webinar. We'll have another one probably in the fall. So if you're not a neuroscience section member, make sure that when you renew your membership, or you can actually log into your profile, you can check a box to become a member of the neuroscience section. So make sure that you do that. And I'll just introduce, so Kevin Williams was our inaugural chair for the neuroscience section. Thomas Lutz is our chair-elect for next year. And then we have Christy Townsend, Ames Sutton, and Christine McDermott, who are also members of the, I guess, steering committee of the section. So thanks to all of you for coming and joining us, and Ames, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Darlene. So this section, or this seminar, is mostly going to be focused on, or our goal for this was for folks to think about ways to achieve funding that are outside of the realm of like the normal, typical funding schemes. So a lot of us know about the typical funding mechanisms, both for folks that are independent as well as trainees, the R mechanisms at NIH, NSF mechanisms, F mechanisms as well. But we're thinking about this more in the concept of partnerships, say, with industry, foundational mechanisms of support, how you go about getting those avenues of support. And so that's really going to be what the conversation today is about. The goal for this is to be very informal. I'm going to lead it, but if you have ideas, questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box, raise your hand, whatever is best for you. So to start, I think it would be best for our panelists to just give a brief, maybe a half-minute to minute introduction on their kind of their career path, and with these ideas in mind in terms of diversifying your portfolio. So I think I'll start with Randy. Randy, do you mind giving a brief introduction?
No, I'm happy to do it. And again, I'm really thankful for the invitation to be here. So my name is Randy Seeley. I'm at the University of Michigan, where I'm the director of the Nutrition Obesity Research Center at the University of Michigan, and run a research lab that has done lots of partnerships with industry over the years, and happy to talk a little bit about what the criteria for doing that looks like.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy. Flo, do you mind going next?
Happy to go next. Thank you also for the invitation. So my name is Flo Thiels. I'm a program director at the National Science Foundation, or NSF. That's what the abbreviation stands for. There were multiple requests. So one is where we come from and how we got here. And so I was a faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh before I joined the NSF as a program director. I'm a neurobiologist. My own research was on reward-motivated behavior and the biological basis thereof, and more importantly, actually synaptic plasticity as related to learning and memory. And here at the NSF, I principally run a program on neural systems, not surprising given my background, but I'm also involved in various programs that are focused on the Brain Initiative. So many of them are cross-directorate. The NSF is the National Science Foundation for all STEM disciplines, not just biology. And I also spend half of my time in a directorate called Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. It's a new directorate at the NSF. It was created 2 years ago, and it is very much focused on partnerships with industry, on shortening the gap between basic research, which is historically where NSF's investments have been and continue to be, but also through this new directorate to accelerate the transition to application for societal benefit. And so I'm happy to elaborate on that more. And so with that, I hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Flo. That was great. I think we'll go to, I'm just going around my screen. Robert Rivers. Do you go
Hey,
by
good
Rob?
afternoon. Yeah, I go by Rob, but
Great.
Rob. Hi, my name's Rob Rivers. I'm a program officer at the National Institutes of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases. It's a mouthful, like all things in the government, for the National Institutes of Health. And I'm the acting director of the Office of Minority Health Research Coordination, where we fund research and training related to not only diversifying the workforce, but addressing health disparities and health equity within NIDDK missionary diseases. And my background, I'm actually a protein chemist, so I'm kind of the odd person out of this call, but always happy to share about opportunities we have here.
Great. Thanks so much. My screen shifted a bit, so now we're going to go down to Kathy. Kathy, do you mind going next?
Hi, Kathryn Richmond, Executive Vice President. I lead the Paul G. Allen Frontiers Group. I work closely with the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation. Our offices are in the Institute, but I'll explain that all later. The Allen Institute does not give out philanthropic funding for science, but the Family Foundation and the Frontiers Group works for that. So eager to talk about the role of science philanthropy. I've been with the organization for over a decade, and my career path was in academia, PhD, postdoc, helped with on a management team for DOE Bioenergy Center. Broad portfolio, really excited to talk about how to get more science going.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. And then Bex, you're up.
Great, thank you. So my name is Rebekah Bower, but I do go by Bex. I'm from Boehringer Ingelheim, and I'm a senior scientist in the cardiometabolic disease research space. I run preclinical programs in the obesity space and also some MASH work as well. I'm here today to discuss some, I guess, less conventional approaches for funding opportunities in collaboration with academia through our open science initiative that we have at Boehringer Ingelheim. And I'll discuss more of the details with that to follow. My formal training before coming here to BI in Connecticut, I was in New Zealand. I did my PhD and a postdoc down there with Debbie Hay, studying peptides that regulate food intake behavior centrally. And so I have a little bit of, I guess, CNS neuro background, but now it's a little bit broader now that I've joined the industry. So I've been with BI for 3 years.
Awesome. Thanks to everybody. So the way I formatted this is I have a few questions that I'll ask. I kind of am going to start with a couple of folks, but please, if you have something to add and I don't necessarily ask you, please raise your hand or just pop in and add your 2 cents for that. And then Chrissy put in the chat as well. Feel free, folks that are on the call, to drop questions that you find would be useful to get answered as it relates to this conversation. So I think to start, what I'll first do is ask a couple of folks in the federal government, something related to funding for systemically marginalized individuals. And so I think I'll start this for Rob, if you don't mind starting this conversation. So I guess what we're really interested in is what are the current challenges with efforts to promote efforts to increase funding to systemically marginalized individuals? And do you feel like what do you think the plans are for the future, especially with federal funding? You know, all of us are kind of like, does that change with different administrations? How do you look like, you know, in the next couple of years versus long-term planning, and how does that work in federal institutions?
Do you want my opinion or do you want the federal opinion? So I'll give you the federal opinion first.
How about both? Yeah.
As a federal employee, we have no real control over federal appropriations. And I think the projections moving forward are that at least in the National Institutes of Health, the budgets will be flat and not growing, regardless of future administration. So it's going to be I think this workshop indeed is timely, thinking about how individuals can diversify their funds or the funds to do their research in lab, because just ensuring that you're going to get your RPG or research program grants or R01 and fund your lab and ride that R01 for the next 20 plus years and just slightly change the aims as you learn more things. I don't think that's a tangible path I see folks in agreement. Like there's no way you can do that, and you shouldn't think to do that. So looking about potentially outside sources of funding, whether it comes from the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, or industry, and thinking in all the different ways how your research can be funded and supported. To go back to the initial question about what types of funding to really ensure that our research workforce represents the full diversity of the US population. I think as a result of the Supreme Court ruling related to Harvard and the University of North Carolina, that what we've done in the past is no longer what we can do now. But I don't think that should be seen as a huge negative. I think we need to look at this as the glass half full situation. So the things we've been able to do for 30 plus years didn't make a huge impact. Because if we still look at the populations, if we go to conferences, they're not as diverse as the US population. So I think it's a situation where all of us need to rethink what can we do to ensure that folks coming into our research groups, into our labs, the undergraduates and so forth, how do we ensure that we're bringing in everyone and looking at talent regardless of zip code, and talent regardless of race, ethnicity, or background. And I think even with the older programs that we can no longer run, I don't know if we did that so well, because if we had been working successfully, those programs would have sunsetted, and they did. So let's look at it as a positive, and as things change, continue to morph and change with them to ensure that we meet the goal of like addressing the many deleterious issues in health that we need to be facing. So I
That
gave
was
you
great.
all government answers.
Yeah,
Sorry about
I
that.
like that.
Like I have
Maybe
the government up behind me, so I'm sticking on the government.
That's fair. Okay, maybe at another time we'll get personally answered. Flo, I know that NSF has a lot of programs specifically targeting individuals from systemically marginalized backgrounds. Can you speak some to those mechanisms and how you see that unfolding based on your time there?
Yeah, so I do want to echo what Rob said. I mean, fundamentally, we don't make decisions. However, there are, or individual program directors don't make decisions. And even at the highest level, there is, I think the hands are more tied than the community thinks, the community out there thinks. And actually, that's a call to the community to be active and involved and speak to lawmakers, because they can have an influence on decision-making of lawmakers. There are a number of programs. And so the NSF, and I would argue, actually, quite frankly, my experience working with colleagues at the NIH, we all collectively do want to change the landscape or the composition of who's applying and who's successful. And so there are mechanisms in place to increase. The first step is to increase applications from institutions that are historically more or less resourced, as well as from individuals that you can think of as participating less within the scientific enterprise. There are some programs that are specifically targeting that at a large level. For instance, the NSF focuses on, and I always have to look it up because we always speak in abbreviations. There is a whole effort of, it's called Established Program to Stimulate Competitive Research. And that's actually looking not at marginalized institutions or marginalized individuals, but marginalized states. So this is a program that focuses on NSF investments in states that historically have received less funding. So I'm starting at that sort of really high level. Then there are programs such as, for instance, out of the Biological Sciences Directorate at the NSF, there's a program called Building Research Capacity in the Biological Sciences. Those are awards for individuals who are affiliated with less resourced organizations. And you can think of them, or sometimes in our own thinking, we look at these awards as setup funds. So it's for starting investigators, individuals who just started their labs. And BRC Bio, I think, is the abbreviation. So building research capacity of new faculty in biology. And that really is targeting very explicitly individuals who are not at R1 institutions, but at less resourced institutions. And then, and I suspect, but Rob, correct me here if I'm wrong, there are programs, there are not necessarily special programs, but program directors make their decisions, their recommendations as to what they would like to recommend for support, taking many different factors into account, including demographics of the investigator, demographics of the institution, so that there is balance as much as possible across the broader what we call portfolio. And so it's at the individual program director level also where there's engagement in trying to what we call broaden participation. But I want to stress again that the participation is not just at the individual investigator level, it's also at the institutional level and at the level of states. And this new directorate, while I'm talking about I mentioned earlier TIP, this new directorate, there are a whole bunch of programs that are focused very explicitly on going after making investment in regions that have been historically left behind in the economic boom. So for instance, what I call the regional innovation engines are large-scale investments up to $160 million over 10 years to build up partnerships between industry, nonprofits, local governments, and academic institutions to foster really the enterprise. And it's the enterprise of research and innovation is viewed as one that involves more than just academia.
That's great. Thanks, Flo. I guess since you spoke about these partnerships, it kind of leads me to ask Kathy a question, which is, one, do you all fund do you have programmatic systems to kind of reach these needs as well? And then also, does your institute, do they participate in like cross collaboration across industry, academia, stuff like that?
Okay, so this is my chance to unpack a little bit more about who we are. When I started about 12 years ago with the Paul J. Allen Family Foundation, I don't think science philanthropy or funding of science research through philanthropy had as much of a footprint, depending on your field, depending on your area. And so now I think in the last decade, you've seen a number of significant philanthropic efforts come to the fore to support basic research science as well as translational efforts. It runs the gamut as to the size and scope and focus of those. And so I would say that you have a really large and diverse number of efforts funding science through philanthropy, and they run the gamut of what the focus is and what success looks like, and whether or not it's at the fellowship, an intern, early career investigator, team science, in any number of different fields. So it's hard for me to bin exactly what it looks like now, but I can say it's significant. It's cumulatively significant, and it's on the order of billions that are going in to support science. And so it's a really exciting time to consider that, because it is one of the many mechanisms you can look to diversify and try out bold ideas. Now, we're part of that ecosystem. When Paul Allen started the Allen Institute 20 years ago, that's what we consider his intramural science philanthropy. The Paul J. Allen Frontiers Group works with the Family Foundation to look for exciting science that occurs outside of those walls. So we have a couple of programs that we run targeting investigators and center level initiatives. And because, as you can see, our name is Frontiers, we really rotate as to where we can have the most impact and where that frontier is. So although if you look at our portfolio online, we have a number of funding efforts in neuroscience, we really try to go where we can make a difference and not be duplicative. My federal colleagues have amazing efforts going on. And so can we de-risk other areas, or are there things that are a little too early? There's any number of criteria that we use to see where we can have the most impact with our investments. And this goes also in changing the ecosystem that's been part of where this discussion is, as far as we believe good science can be done anywhere. So how do we find those ideas? How do we find those investigators? How do we find those campuses? And that's something that we work with all of you on the call, both our colleagues at the federal level, both the societies, and outreach as much as we can to plug in to connect the initiatives we have with the researchers that could be most impacted by that, or whose research aligns with it. So I hope I answered the question. There's a lot of funding out there. It's a matter of trying to find each other when these initiatives are occurring. And some of the best ways I would say doing it could be just paying attention to the acknowledgement slides to see who in those areas are funding and where they're starting to fund, and signing on to newsletters. Most of the foundations have newsletters, and you can quickly scan to see how they're going. And many of them have significant footprints in neuroscience, or in a variety of areas, or they're like us and they rotate, but you do have those touch points. And so I'll stop there because I could keep talking, but happy to have this conversation.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm really, like, I kind of keep thinking, I really like the idea of how you can kind of pick up, Kathy, what you were mentioning, picking up where like the federal agencies, maybe something that's, you can de-risk those types of innovations that would, might bolster success with academia and industry and nonprofit institutions. And that's something that, Chloe, you were mentioning. And so I guess this kind of leads me to ask Randy a question, which is, as somebody who's been very successful forming these academic industry partnerships, can you tell us a bit how you initially got connected to industry and kind of your trajectory since your first connections with industry partners?
Happy to. And I think this, what I'm going to tell you speaks to the barriers along these lines, right? I mean, so the story I'm going to tell you, right, is not one that again makes it easier, right? So I think there are more of these outreach efforts, right, from companies, and I think Bex is going to talk to some of that, and you should take advantage of. But I can tell you that the way I did this was pretty idiosyncratic, and what I mean by that is most of the relationships I ended up with companies started with me being an advisor on an advisory board. So therefore, getting to hear about what their projects are and what they were working on and where their stumbling blocks were, and then being able to say, well, we could help you fix that, right? We can help you figure that out. And so that is, that is a privileged version of how to go through this, right? Like you get invited on advisory boards, and now you're able to be somewhat on the inside and be able to strike those relationships, as well as understand enough about what they're trying to do, right, to be able to offer solutions. The other way I think to think about this, right, if you're sitting in your academic lab, right, is when you're at poster sessions, when you're at meetings, right, approaching folks, right, who work in industry and being willing to engage a conversation with them about the science. I'm always amazed by how many academics won't do that, either because they're intimidated or, to be honest, right, that they think it's somehow sullying them, right, to have some interaction back and forth with industrial partners. That somehow, again, it's not science in some pristine version that they have in their head. But approaching those folks and having real scientific conversations with them about what's going on is the beginning blocks for all of that, right, in terms of these non-systematic versions, right, like what Bex is going to talk about, like an effort by Boehringer Ingelheim to actually reach out on a topic, right, and try to, that is actually, for my, over the course of my career, that has been very rare, right, that I have found my way into these relationships by that path. That doesn't make it right. It just, again, I think there's going to be more of this, particularly around obesity and diabetes, right, because of the nature of the topic and the dollars that are flowing into it. So it is like a lot of things, right? It's about connections, right? So networking matters, and having parts of your network be associated with folks who are in industry. One of the things I will tell people, right, is that once you know somebody who is in one industry spot, the chances that they stay only in that company is really low. I can tell you we have one person which they're on their fourth company, for which we have now developed a relationship with, right? So point is, when you make those connections, right, it will broaden how many companies you can have contact with, because they are going to move from company to company, right? That is part of the nature of the beast. And that, again, helps you expand your network sort of by de facto, right?
That's awesome. Thank you, Randy. And I'm going to Bex, I promise I'm coming to you, but I know that Flo has to leave a little bit early, so I wanted to ask one more question before Flo has to bounce. Flo, specifically as it relates to these initiatives that you all have set up to try and kind of serve these communities that are underserved, what is the actual practical, like in terms of industry academia partnership and even nonprofit as well, like what are the pros and cons of incorporating these large conglomerates of different agencies together when you're, say, submitting a proposal to that versus just having an academic partnership across multiple institutions?
Yeah, good question, because there are lots of challenges, and I actually want to build on something that Randy said, is this building the networks, right? So, and if the networks, you're now talking about networks across sectors, as opposed to within academia, that's a within sector network. And if I can put in a plug for professional societies, I actually think this is a space where professional societies can play an enormous facilitatory role, not just as a clearinghouse for, what kind of funding opportunities are out there. As Kathy mentioned, there really are a lot of different funding opportunities. And if we only look at, the federal agencies, we're leaving out a whole swath of opportunities that are out there. But I also think in terms of helping build these networks. And so I'm just throwing this out there for the professional societies to see whether or not they can set up workshops where they're, from speed dating across sectors to just random, as we call them, random collisions, putting people together in a room and encourage them to talk to one another. Because it turns out that there is a barrier. I do totally echo what Randy said, but the barriers can be overcome, and it's just to start talking with one another. So to more specifically how at NSF, and it's really through this TIP director, so I encourage to go to the NSF website, actually specifically to the TIP directorate website. There are various opportunities, and they're typically not geared for individual investigators because it takes more than one investigator to build these networks. So there are many calls that ask for not just team science. I think, Kathy, you mentioned team science, but team science explicitly across sectors. So having individuals reach out, and I would argue tech transfer offices may also be a source for that, for those institutions that have tech transfer offices, to connect with industry, to connect with nonprofits, and ideally on issues that are issues for the region, right? The idea is to really leverage who's nearby and thinking about the same problem, but from a different perspective with a different expertise. And yes, and even for me, I'm a basic scientist, and so initially starting to work with my colleagues within the NSF that are more commercialization, if I may use that term, focused, was like, what? That's what I'm going to get involved in. But the reality is that it is valuable if we can have those conversations. It doesn't mean that one leaves one's identity as a basic scientist behind, but one learns another language. One learns to think about how one's work can have application beyond. And again, this is not necessarily at an individual investigator level, although the NSF, it's now housed in TIP, has the ICOR program, and I wish I knew what it stood for, and I'm sorry. We all think in abbreviations, as well as the SBIR, Small Business Innovation and Research Programs. So there are, and NIH has that as well, and other federal agencies, by the way. And so if there's any way in which you think your science could have extension into an application, then take the step to reach out to the tech transfer office, to look at the federal agencies' opportunities, such as the Small Business Innovation and Research. And again, I'm sorry, I don't know what the ICOR stands for. I'll put it in, I don't know, can the audience actually see the chat? Because then I put it in chat. Okay, I'll put it in chat. So there are, and the ICOR program is great because it also is not just for faculty. It's a great program for postdocs, graduate students and postdocs, because that's a juncture where you start thinking, in which direction do I want to go with my interest in science? And there are many ways in which one can apply one's skills to advance our science and innovation. So,
can I add one small thing to that too? Because like you talk about, again, I think that expanding your networks, right, across sectors, right, is really important in terms of expanding your horizons. it expands the horizons of your trainees too, right? It expands their possibilities, both in terms of them evaluating whether these other possibilities are things they might want to do and their capability to get them, right? So in our lab, right, we definitely have had people who have landed in industry jobs, and a part of it was because they had industry collaborations along the way as part of being a fellow. And that made them more competitive, right, to get those jobs. So it's not just you, it's your trainees as well.
That's awesome. Thanks. And I'm going to come back to the trainee question, specifically talking about funding mechanism for trainees across all of these different platforms. But before we do that, I want to get to Bex. So Bex, you mentioned, you kind of teased I think it was Open Science, what was it? Open Science Initiative. So do you mind telling us a bit about how that came about, if you're aware, and then also like how it is, how it works and how we can become involved in it?
Yeah, no problem. It's actually really interesting. It was an initiative that I became aware of, I guess, shortly after I joined BI. I hadn't really been involved or aware of others that are similar to this. So I think it started in 2016, and it really was the brainchild of some medicinal chemists in our company. We make a lot of molecules for programs across a whole variety of different TAs, therapeutic indications, and programs that don't end up moving forward. And the chemists were saying it's a real shame. We put these molecules into a repository, they're not really used again. They kind of just go and snooze somewhere in a repository and are never used. What can we do about this? And that's where the Open Science Initiative was really kind of born, was through these med chemists who wanted to make these molecules accessible for researchers and academics so that we can actually progress science, so that we can, reach the clinic faster for patients and progress basic science initiatives as well as translational science. So what they did was they started with a molecules to order initiative. So we actually have, I'll share our website. Our Open Science website is called openme.com, and it has a variety of different platforms available on it, depending on what you're looking for. Molecules for Collaboration was one of the first proposal-based initiatives that we started. So I'll back up a little bit. Molecules to Order is part of the initiative that started where we make all of our molecules available to people online. So you can actually search for different indications if you're interested in CNS-based obesity things or cancer, a whole wide variety. We have a whole repository of molecules you can search through, and you can order them for free. They ship them out of Germany, and I think if it's an international shipment, there might be a small fee that's associated with that. But what really that triggered was a whole kind of waterfall of new collaborations, new connections, and getting our name out there a little bit more. Because we're a private company, we're really working on our external visibility. And so that's one of the ways that we really wanted to get our names out there, because we want more collaborators, we want more visibility, and we want to progress our science more quickly and in better ways. So they started Molecules for Collaboration, which is one of the initiatives in open science that we have at BI, and it's very similar to Molecules to Order, except that what we do is we pose research questions, asking specific biological questions around a key molecule. So say we have gotten to some end stages with a key molecule of interest that we have a target for, but we weren't able to purpose it for that particular indication, but we don't want that molecule not to get used. We put up a campaign reaching out to researchers all around the world, asking them to submit proposals on how they might go about using that molecule, either to repurpose it, to discover new biology for it, or any idea really that they have around using that molecule so that it actually gets used within the scientific space. So the way that we do it is we pose these questions on the OpenMe website, and that is Molecules for Collaboration. And you can look at the different molecules that we have on offer. We just recently released a KRAS G12C molecule that has a lot of potential scope to be used for these types of things. And so that's available on Molecules to Order. And there's a whole variety of different campaigns that you can look at for specific molecules that you might want to repurpose for your science on Molecules for Collaboration. But the one I wanted to speak about a little bit more today is Open to Experts, because I have more experience with that. And that was actually born a couple of years ago, right after I joined BI. All the success that we reached with the Molecules to Order and Molecules for Collaboration and the new collaborations and relationships we started building through the platform energized us to look at different ways that we can reach out to other researchers and build networks and collaborations in other ways. And so what we're using Open to Experts for is, for instance, I can use an example. We're very interested in trying to find new molecules to exploit fetal cycles in obesity-related research. So that was one of my Open to Experts calls for CMDR specifically. And we just put out that open question, and there's in-scope and out-of-scope criteria that are defined for each of these biological questions that we pose to the scientific community. And what we do is we welcome researchers from all over the world to submit a proposal. It's kind of like a small grant. It's a 1 to 2 page proposal where you go about the different ways that your lab or your research could answer that specific question in the hopes of obtaining funding. I think it's 200 to 250,000 euros for a 2-year collaboration with scope for extension. And we've met all kinds of people trying to fill these gaps in knowledge and expertise that we need to try to progress our science more quickly. And it's been a really, really successful initiative. I think with CMDR, we have more than 80% success rate in answering the questions that we pose online, making new collaborations. And it's really cool to see what people are doing across the world in different research labs and how they go about answering these questions and fitting their science to the things that we pose. So I think for us, the way that we could do a little bit better is in our outreach and trying to get the word out there to what's possible. And when we actually have these new initiatives on the website, it's a little bit sporadic because it's based on need, and also one of the researchers to take lead of these things and to make these research questions and start the whole campaign. So it's a little bit hit and miss, but there's always things going, and it's going across TAs and in development and research, and there's all kinds of opportunities. And even if we don't pick your proposal as a finalist, I can say that we very extensively review all the proposals that we get, and we tailor our letters in response to each individual lab, and we give lots of consideration to each of the proposals we receive. But it's been really great for creating networks and new collaborations that may not be as a result of a campaign, but it's been really good for outreach for us. And it's a really, really great resource to use, I think, if you're looking for something a little bit more unconventional in terms of funding and also networking.
That's awesome. This is so cool. I haven't seen this before, so I'm so glad that we have you here. And I guess to follow up and kind of related to what I mentioned that I wanted to talk about is I see that there's also postdoc grants here. And this is something that when we think about diversifying our portfolios, this is something that as a trainee, I was very much of the like F mechanisms at NIH. I did not know much about postdoc mechanisms, even at foundations, but definitely not in industry. And I think now that I have started talking to more folks, and I don't know if they're more readily available now, but I have learned about them more. And so I'm interested to hear about the postdoc grant that you have listed here, and also if you all have postdoc funding mechanisms like outside of this. How does that actually work, and how does that get facilitated?
It's a really good question. I'm sorry, there's so much to say about this. We have so many different platforms and so much reach. The Open to Talents portion of our Open Science initiative is very new. I think we launched it just last year in Biberach in Germany. And it's posed in a very similar way to our Open to Experts campaigns, where we pose a specific biological question or a problem that we have, and we ask postdocs to submit a grant in a very similar way, like a 1 to 2 pager proposal on how they would use their expertise or their current lab environment to answer that question. Sorry, I need to back up. They would actually be working in our labs in Biberach to come answer that research question. So really, they're hired based on the experience and the ideas and the creativity that they come up with when they submit their little proposals for this. It's very new. We were really struggling to find someone with expertise in retinopathies and some of the basic skills that we needed to fill for a different postdoc role. And so we decided to leverage the OpenMe platform to try to see if we could also recruit talent. And we were very successful in our first attempt at doing that. We actually found a very good, talented postdoc to join our team in Biberach. And we are trying to expand that now into the United States. So we're working with our Open Science team now to see if we can tease through some of the legal questions to fit the model to our site in Ridgefield as well. So watch this space because we're hoping we can get this up and running in 2025. And we're very interested in expanding our postdoc program here at Richfield and also in our Biberach, Germany site. So yeah, that's going to be kind of up and coming. But the pilot attempt at this was largely successful last year. So we're hopeful moving forward that this is going to be a nice way for us to recruit new talent into our company as well.
That's great. Thanks. And Kathy, I guess the question for you is, the funding mechanisms that you all have, do they expand the depth of career levels in science, or is it predominantly focused on individuals that have independent research programs?
So that's a great question. The current programs that we have really are agnostic of where in your career arc that you are placed. We focus on the idea, not necessarily if you're an early career investigator, not necessarily any of those other aspects. We do have center level grants where we ask for teams to come together on a hard problem or one that really could move the field. That being said, I think, well, I know we're talking internally right now to say what does the science ecosystem need? When we launched the Frontiers Group about 10 years ago, I think all of us would agree that a lot has happened in the last 10 years to the ecosystem. And I think particularly in philanthropy, we want to be nimble and be responsive to how could we be supporting science better? What are new mechanisms that we could consider or at least pilot to try? Because there are new pain points that maybe weren't as obvious 10 years ago, and the speed at which some of the fields are moving or some of the needs that different efforts have are different. So that's something we're examining to see again, how can we have the most impact? How can we pilot some new ways of doing science and supporting science? And I'm always eager to have those conversations. And just going back to a point that was noted earlier about networks, it's definitely so helpful to go across sectors that was already noted by a number of the other panelists. I would say that even in philanthropy, talking to one foundation, one organization, we all talk to each other. And so particularly if we are funding in the same areas. And so even if we aren't going after X in area Y, we talk to one another. We have there, unfortunately, one of the challenges I think facing the community writ large is there are so many more ideas than there is funding. And so we want to see as much science get supported and advanced as possible. So all of these things can be benefited from networks, either across the networks that I'm in philanthropy, but also I talked across networks to industry and to academia and societies. We've had partnerships with a variety of those sectors. So again, I just don't think, I think siloing yourself away, you miss some opportunities, and there's always benefit because even if the people you talk to leave that sector, as was noted, they don't leave necessarily science. So again, I don't think any conversation is a waste. To approach people, to have coffee. If you're an introvert, just set yourself up for one coffee per conference. It's a great way to break it down, and then reach out and see what their networks could get you if there's a thread to pull. And so I'll stop there. This is just I'm really excited about some of the topics that we're touching on.
Thanks, that's great. As an introvert, I appreciate the one coffee per day of the conference. Before
James,
we get too
can I add just one thing to that?
Yeah,
Because I think it's really it's sort of important. So again, having those connections is really important and making that as a connection. But what I think in most academics that I see trying to do this, I always say they talk too much and listen too little, right? And I know Dar is already laughing at the irony of me talking about talking less, since I am not known to be a wilting lily. But it really is true, right? You have to listen to what other people want to do. So again, Bex was talking about they are putting out calls for things, areas of research that they think are important. And you may think, well, I have the greatest idea ever. Like that, again, Boehringer should want to give me money because this is the best target ever. This is the best. It all may be true, but they're not going to listen to you unless they've had a relationship with you. You've been able to, but you're much more likely to get your idea back into the ecosystem of this if you've done other things to help them, right? So again, looking at these things is not just as opportunities, right? To find out what problems other people have, whether you're a foundation, right? And you've identified areas of work, right, that you think you need to get done, or you're a company, but you have to listen, right? You can't jump into every conversation trying to shove your ideas down their throat about how brilliant it is. And it's what academia rewards, right? It's people who do that and take that style. And so you just have to take a breath and step back as part of the process, right, of being able to build these cross-sector networks. They know a lot more about what they're trying to do than you know about what they're trying to do. And I'm always amazed by the naivete, often from academics, and their lack of understanding of their naivete, right? It's not being naive is the problem. It's not knowing that you're naive that's the problem. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would say we often say that we fully understand that you've already voted with your career. You think the most important thing is X, and that's why you're studying it. You've devoted your time and your effort to X. So we understand that you voted that way. That being said, you have to tap into your base curiosity of what else is going outside of that, and what the possibilities are and where these intersections could be, because it's an evolution, and all of these things are fascinating in and of their own right. And so to not be aware or not be plugged in or listen to those conversations, again, as was said, it's kind of a missed opportunity there, and it may not get the traction or the engagement that you'd think.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I saw Flo nodding your head as well. So I'm wondering if at the federal level, both Flo and Rob, if you can speak to, especially, there are funding goals for every institute, right? And a lot of times it feels like we're trying to like fit a square peg into a round hole, like trying to make it work versus maybe trying to just find another institute, or maybe we can talk about, there's a lot of special calls that the NIH has. And so I'm wondering if what you all think about, trying to kind of fit your research into what the funding goals of the federal institutes are versus, kind of holding out those ideas that don't necessarily work perfectly and holding those for like a special call or some other funding mechanism at the federal level. Whoever wants to.
Rob, you want to comment on it? Please go first, and then I have some thoughts, but please.
Yeah, so sometimes I think it's been mentioned that folks have the greatest idea in the world, and they try to fit your greatest idea in the world to every request for funding application or notice of funding opportunity, NOFOs, no joke, it's a NOFO, that we have. But read the request and make sure that what we're asking for, that what you're doing is responsive. And I think this is important whether you're looking for support and funding from industry or from the federal government. They're lengthy documents, but usually there's like a page worth in there that says clearly, this is what we're investing in, or this is what we want. So the only time you should apply to something to the government when you just have the greatest idea that you think is ever are for standard R01 research program grants, where it's just your brilliant idea is being reviewed amongst all the other brilliant ideas. But if there's specific set aside funding, usually there's a specific set aside that we're saying we're looking for folks that answer these types of questions. And I think oftentimes in industry, it's similar. They're looking for specific expertise to answer specific questions. So the piggyback what everyone else has said, it's worthwhile talking to people, listening to people. And before you submit anything to the federal government or to a private potential funder, if possible and if it's allowable, just talk to us. I know on the federal side, we're all former scientists that have these PO roles, and we like seeing good science get through. So we're gonna give you as much insights as we can provide that's legally available to help you develop a better application to fund your research and work. So I think those are my 2 cents.
I totally agree with reach out to program directors or to individuals from the organizations but do your homework. So read whatever has been published about it so that you are presumably coming with ideas that could find traction. I'm a neuroscientist, so it's a little bit the neurotransmitter and the receptor. So somehow there should be a potential for fit. But I also want to, this listening, I can't overstress it. It's sort of be ready to pitch, but then also to pivot when you listen, right? So that flexibility, that mental flexibility actually can be very important. And also learning different, I feel like learning different languages, not saying, how when somebody didn't understand something, we usually say it louder as opposed to using different words to say the same thing. Because if the other person didn't hear it, unless the other person has a hearing problem, it probably was the words we used in order to say it that didn't work. And so really, creating situations of dialogue and that curiosity, being willing to learn the other's language. And certainly what I've learned by listening to the colleagues who are more operating in the commercial space here at the NSF is, if there's not a user, then you're not going to go anywhere. And so that listening is very, very important. And I think that as I look at the head nodding, that is important for the federal agencies as it is for the nonprofits, as it is for the profits. If you want to have teamwork, then you have to work as a team. That doesn't mean that you're the driver.
That's a great point. And I guess kind of building on that, the take home here of what I hear is that, listening to what the goals of whatever the agency company is are the most important. But I guess something I'm wondering is when that pitch comes in, say for NSF, NIH, Allen, BI, whatever, are there different strategies that folks need to be using across these domains? And maybe Randy, you might be able to speak to this as somebody who's, kind of gone in multiple domains. Are there strategies that you use just in your scientific communication, just like actually in the proposal, that are different between these sites?
Oh, I think they're very different, right? Again, writing an R01, right, is driven by novelty in a very fundamental way, right? And you are trying to entice in reviewers primarily with the novelty of what it is that you're going to try to do. The needs assessment, right, of how important is this in terms of a direct need becomes not irrelevant, right, in R1, but it is not the only criteria, right? When you're talking to these other folks, right, you're going to have to show them the needs assessment about why it's important, right? Why it's critical. Again, and the timelines are generally going to be shorter, right? It is not going to be over that 5-year period, right? We're talking about for an NIH grant, right? You're going to have to be able to say why it's going to matter to them in a much shorter time frame. And so, and that's again why the listening part is so critical, right? That audience is going to have to be able to look at this and know, yeah, this can fit into my next 6 months and help me, right, in some way, in a way that is quite different than the way an NIH study section is going to deal with it. Again, academic science is so driven by novelty rather than reproducibility, right, and the solidness of the stuff. And those are emphasized very differently, right, depending on your audience. And again, at Boehringer Ingelheim, I'm sure, like, it has to work before they can make any money, right? There's no way around this, right? It's going to have to go through a clinical trial. And so I guarantee you at Boehringer Ingelheim and all these other companies, they have lots of process, right, to vet what you've done to find out whether in fact it's solid enough for them to make an investment in, right? Sometimes that's taking the data and doing their own assessments of the analysis, right? I've seen many companies do that. So you're just going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to hit those marks much higher, right, than you will with an NIH proposal in general. Again, that needs assessment, right, is really important. That requires for you to have understood what it is their needs are.
That's super helpful. Go ahead.
So if I can just add, I think, Jacob, that's for the federal agencies, so certainly the R01 type, what we call core proposals, it's the idea that is the key piece. Whereas I think in industry, but those in industry, please correct me, it's really the solution and the sustainability, right? So it has to address a pain point. Whereas I never heard of the concept of pain point until I started working in the TIP directorate. Whereas that's not how I approached the science. It was really, you know, the idea, the novelty of the idea, and it opening new doors, as opposed to in the other case, you really want to solve concrete problems, and it has to be sustainable. So that sustainable piece is also very important from what I understand.
I think this goes to like NIH reviewers are not your customers.
Yes.
Right? Right. Again, the people who you're talking to are the ones who actually are giving, they're not giving you the money. It's not their money, right? It's not their careers that matter about whether you have done what you've said you're going to do, right? And that does put the person who's reviewing this in a very different position than it is when you sit on a study section.
Yeah, I would just add for philanthropy, some of the common framework when going in and looking at new initiatives is why this, why us, why now? Because we want to be timely, we want to be responsive, but we realize that there's a huge framework of other efforts going on out there, and so we really still want to be able to make a difference. And if this is going to get done without us, then where can we find that that way to propel other ideas that are amazing, but fall between the cracks and or challenge dogma or the like. There's a whole list of things that we look for. And so, yeah, knowing your audience, I saw that in the comments. I totally agree. You have to read the room too if you see eyes glazing over because your pitch has gone on a little bit too long. Just being really responsive and listening. It really has to be a two-way street to have the best start of that engagement, network, and relationship.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. I think I'm going to open it up so that if folks have questions, we're right at 2:30 now. So if folks need to leave, that's all right as well. But if anybody in the audience has questions, anybody else that they would like, you know, we have a great panel here of experts across all different domains. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute and ask away.
I'll throw something out for the audience to chew on. How many folks here have tried to work with their contracting office for a non-federal government contract, right? So your institution likely has a very good process, right, for dealing with the NIH, or has a process, maybe good or bad, right? But it has a process for how to deal with it. Again, but have you dealt with the process, right, for something that is outside of that? Again, that can be foundations can cause other kinds of headaches, right, for institutions, or industry contracts that have intellectual property issues and whatever, right? Have anybody had something where they've tried to do that and either been successful or failed or had problems with it?
I guess I'm technically an audience member, but yes, we've had to back out of an industry contract because of IP disagreements with Ohio State.
Yeah, I mean, I think so we talked earlier about, I do think developing a relationship with your tech transfer office is a really good idea, right? To understand, again, who the right people are. But also at Michigan, we have what essentially is a business development office. It's called Fast Forward Medical Innovation. And their job is to help negotiate these things, but also to help you find them, right? So they are really good people to talk to help you both smooth the edges around some of these contract issues and try to figure out some of these things, right? Rather than get them all the way to the tech transfer office, right? And a lawyer at the university, right? Whose job it is to protect the university, right? Rather than think about the opportunities. I think it's really useful, right? So if you most, at least large research organizations, have some version of this, some sort of business development office. Really good people to get, because they also hear opportunities, right? They're at a conference, heard something of this, and that they go back and think about you. Oh, yeah, maybe Joe or Jane, right, would be good people for us to connect you to, right? They're there to help connect those dots, and I think they're really that, various levels of effectiveness, of course, right, from place to place, but super helpful, right, to make a relationship with those kinds of people. Christy, do you want to say what happened? I mean, like, I mean, I don't want to like.
Yeah, I
like
think
what
I
the
can
specific
say.
issue was in terms of
I think I can
where
say.
the IP disagreement really was.
Yeah, so we had a grant essentially from Medtronic to donate some of their spinal cord stimulator devices for an R01, a clinical trial R01 that we got funded. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's Medtronic. They're also huge and they have very strict guidelines, but they wanted all of the raw data from the entire R01, even though they were only donating devices to patients who were not insured. And so there was just no way. I mean, there was going to be IP in the raw data. There's no way we could have given them the raw data. So the institution had to back out of the contract. But the R01's still going forward regardless. It was just, IP.
I think this is, I've certainly seen this happen in both directions, right? Where the industry collaborator, right, was asking for something that just did not make any sense given what their commentators. And I have certainly seen academic institutions, right, that thought that their rights were way beyond what was against. So the simple example that raises, a lot of times we're using compounds that come from the companies, right? And we're trying to figure out how they work as opposed to inventing new compounds. And what intellectual, it's their compound, right? Like, the idea that they're going to hand it to you so you can do something and then you can claim that you should have some percentage of that compound. Well, that's not going to fly, right? As an example, right? Like, and I think rightly so. So again, this happens in both directions, and you don't have to do the negotiation necessarily, right? But you definitely have to get yourself aware of the issues, right? So that you can take a stand on where you think. Again, if you thought you're being that Ohio State was doing that inappropriately, right? That would be a conversation you need to be able to have, right? Or again, with Medtronic, and be able to tell them that, okay, I agree with Ohio State. You're crazy.
Yeah. In this case, I did agree with my institution, but this was 8 months of negotiations back and forth between the two entities. So yeah, they were trying to reach an agreement, but it was an impasse.
I think it points to one of the core salient differences, right? Is that for your NIH grant, there's a very clear roadmap. Usually your sponsor programs people tell you, we want this thing on this date, and this thing on this date, and this thing on this date. And it all flows, and you don't have to be part of every step in the chain, right? Here, you're going to have to be much more part of this, like, because there is no simple roadmap, right? Since all these agreements really can look very different, right?
Yeah.
Again, sometimes you get, we built templates, right, for some sort of fee for service kinds of work, right, to make it simpler, right, to get things through. But it's definitely you as the investigator are going to have to be more involved in some of that back and forth. And I think you have to go in knowing that is going to be part of what happens, is part of diversifying that portfolio.
This could be a good webinar topic in the future.
One question I had that was logistical is, I know, Kathy, you'll be able to speak for your specific foundation. I know that indirects are not typically covered by foundation grants. How does that work with both for the Frontiers group as well as industry? Does industry pay any indirects to universities usually? How does that work? I guess Kathy, you can go first, and then.
I mean, I can speak broadly because that has come up, and it's again one of the things we're looking at going forward. Generally across different science philanthropic organizations, the indirects that are covered range anywhere from 0 to 25%. I think there may be an outlier that's above that, but that's usually just a fraction of what that they would get federally. And I can speak to the fact that so over the last decade, I don't know what I don't know. So I don't know how many organizations didn't apply because of that, but I was told maybe a handful of times that they weren't going to be able to apply because they couldn't do that. Now, some organizations, and again, it's going to vary depending on who you talk to, actually have their development people go out and find someone to provide the match for the indirect costs. Or they have other ways to address that depending on the campus, the framework of that org. But it is something that does come up, and it's real. Those are real costs. So like in the case for the Frontiers group, what we do is we say we don't have the ability, or we don't allow for a flat percent for IDCs, indirect costs, but line item. Tell us what you need the support for, to try and delineate what costs are being incurred and how we can help. And so again, every organization is going to approach that differently, but it is something that comes up regularly and is going to impact different campuses and different labs, in a variety of ways. But I'd love to hear the answer for industry.
I was recently visiting some campus in the last couple of months and heard from them that, this is rumor because I don't know personally, but that their institution was not allowing them. It was either at the school level or the department level. They were not allowing them the PIs to apply for, ADA or AHA grants where they restrict the amount of indirects. So if the indirects were less than a certain percentage, then they weren't going to be allowed to submit, which it seems crazy to me, right? But it is an obstacle.
On the flip side, as the voice of the federal government here, it does impact how much science we can fund. So when your institution has such high indirect costs, we literally sit there and we say, all right, the indirects at X institution means we're basically paying twice for the same science. And that doesn't come into whether we fund something or not, but it's something we're all in budgets where the cost of living is going up higher than our budget authority. It is something for institutions. Maybe it's something you can take back to your deans. Like, can we this isn't helping us do our science necessarily. I think some of it's going to high-paid vice presidents of this and that. That's not really helping the science move forward. I took my NIH cap off to say that. That's just a personal opinion. That's not NIH. That's Rob's opinion.
No, I think so. In the philanthropic community, I think all of us are looking at the cost of what it takes to do science, and how do we adjust to that, and how do we best support it, because it's a zero-sum game. There are just I hear you. And so those are real costs. There are real impacts for the infrastructure needed to support that. And so how do we go forward? And so, like I said, we're re-examining that. We're looking the best to revisit that. And I think many other organizations are too.
Bex, do you know if especially with the OpenMe platform, are indirects typically something considered for folks that apply that in that manner?
I don't think it's been a barrier, but I can't speak to it. I'm not sure.
It's yeah, again, I've had it go both ways, right? So sometimes it has been a barrier, and many times companies, again, aren't really interested. They're interested in what the bottom line number is, and they don't really, how you got there is not so critical. And I think it's one of the other sort of, I think, truisms about this, right? When you're talking about industry relationships in particular, academics are very oriented around what it costs to do the work and not necessarily what its value is, right? So you don't know what it costs to make your iPhone, right? You're paying for the value of it as opposed to what it costs to make, per se, right? And so there's oftentimes, when you're working on these industrial relationships, the thing that they need you to do, right, isn't even that interesting, right? It's something that has to get done, and it has a lot of value, right? It brings it can change the valuation, right, of how they look at an asset. And the thing that you have to do has a small incremental cost to you, but you had to do a lot of work beforehand to get to the point, right, where that incremental cost was real, right? So you had to buy equipment, you had to train people, you had to, if you imagine using mouse models, you have to validate all those mouse models, right? All of that has to be in the cost structure as you're thinking about these industrial relationships. That'll be different than if you're at the NIH or at many foundations, right? You have to understand something about what the value of what you're doing is, not just, again, what the incremental costs are. And that's important in terms of trying to negotiate what the right relationship looks like with an industrial comparator.
Actually, Randy, that I think that's a really important point that people don't consider, right? And so do you have a strategy when you're going in, or talk about your strategy when you're going in and sort of proposing those initial numbers in the negotiation process with companies?
Bex, you wanted to, I'll let Bex.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, as part of the proposal submission, we ask for a breakdown of budget. So I think you can ask for up to 200, but we are always open to negotiate those things. And I've seen all kinds of budgets submitted, depending on the call and where it comes from. It can be extremely detailed down to the consumable, and it could also just be very, very broad. We need this amount for this year of work. So I can speak to the fact that we get breakdowns in budgets. They are negotiable, and we discuss that at length once we select a finalist or a winner, and yeah, we're very amenable to discussions around things like that.
And again, it depends on how important that particular topic is to you and your organization at that time too, right? That you'd be more willing to go higher, right, if it's something that's super important and timely,
yeah.
right?
We've had calls where we've gone up to 500. Like it just depends on the timing. It depends on the question. Depends on the collaboration. Depends on the value. All of the things. So it's kind of an open discussion, and it's negotiable. So it's not just a line and draw in the sand type of deal.
So to Dar's point, right? Again, I do think most academics just don't think about it this way. And Dar, my version about this, right, is again, it's about listening to find out again how valuable this is and how it changes their business model. I'll give you like a more concrete example that didn't come from my own work, but we have a lab here, right, who built a model for doing these catheterizations in pigs, right? And they allows them to test certain kinds of compounds and PK issues and whatever, right? Again, very complicated model. They were one of the only people who could do it. It took them 5 years to build this pig model, right? And they were then going to charge people incremental costs about what it costs to run each pig. But like the value for the industrial collaborator was really high. If the thing worked the way they had hoped, right, the valuation of that item was going to be 20x what it was the day before they did it. So again, you need to put all of that into the idea about what you should charge, right? They couldn't build it themselves. It would take them 5 years, right, to be able to build that capability themselves. And again, my estimate was like about $3 million at least, right, to be able to build that capability. So again, that is a real cost, right? And again, in any MBA, right, doing that calculation, right, would understand that that's a real cost. The other parts of the cost that you have to put into this is opportunity cost, right? What could you not do because you were doing X, Y, or Z, right? And that again has to go into your idea about what it is that you think you should charge for doing this. And again, that becomes a real issue at institutions. We are all at nonprofit institutions, right? So again, how you go about in that negotiation and how you get the university on board, right, is again things that take some experience to do. But you have to get around what just thinking about the incremental cost. Like my mouse per diem is $1 a day, and I'm going to need this many mice, right? That you have to think about it in a little bit different way in order to really set up these relationships so that they make sense for you and for your partner.
And setting realistic milestones. So, as you check in, as you go along through the collaboration, if things are tracking well, things are going well, there's always scope for.
And giving your, again, I think, one of the academic leaders like, well, I'm going to get 4 years, I'm going to get 5 years from NIDDK. And I got all that time to figure out how to do this. Like, and your industrial partners aren't going to work that way, right? Like you have to give them versions of go, no-go decisions, right? Where they can get out, right? Like that they can cut the project off, right? That you need to have a conversation about what it would take, right? To say, okay, this isn't working the way we had hoped. We have to retrench or change directions, or we have to stop, right? Again, and when you give your partner the ability to walk away, right, when it's not working well, their ability to start is way easier, right? And I'm sure that's true for you, Beck. Like you have to go to your manager and say, yep, we're only committing to this for 6 months, right? Again, we hope that we'll keep working on it for 2 years, but we only have to commit for 6 months, and we can stop if we don't get A, B, and C done. Yeah, and that makes it way easier to say yes.
And it goes the other way too. If you reach the 2-year mark and things are close, or they're going well, or it's revealed more questions than answers, as science often does, there's always room for
Yeah.
discussion there on like where we go forward and keeping the collaboration going, keeping the relationship.
Awesome. I think that's a good spot to wrap up. So everybody here, I just want to say thank you. This was super, super informative for me, and it sounds like it was to everybody else as well. I know a couple of folks have dropped off already, but I think it is recorded. Shamika is still here. Shamika, has it been recorded?
Yes, we've been recording the whole time.
Okay, awesome. So we should have access to this post hoc, and yeah, thanks everybody for your time. We appreciate your insights and lots of new knowledge to think about. So thank you.
Thanks for the
Thank you to everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you.